Welcome, everybody. It's 1:59, so we are starting a few seconds early, but that's okay. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and I see we're going to still have a few participants jumping in as we begin here. My name is Bill Bush. I'm a professor of history, and I'm the chair of the Department of Communication, History, and Philosophy at Texas A&M San Antonio. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our special book event for my colleague, Dr. Ed Westerman, for his brand new book, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, which was just recently published by Cornell University Press. For this event, Dr. Westerman is going to sit for an interview with another Holocaust scholar, Dr. Tatjana Lichtenstein from the University of Texas at Austin. I'm going to introduce them both here in just a minute. I wanted to go over a couple of things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Drs. Lichtenstein and Westerman. Because we are doing a Zoom event and not an in-person book event, that means we don't have physical books for sale for our attendees and the opportunity to have Dr. Westerman sign that book for you. What we do have is information about how you can order the book from Cornell and get a 30% discount. And I will be pasting the discount code into the chat here momentarily. I will also email the flyer to all of the attendees with the discount information after this event. As this event progresses, if you have questions, I would ask you to post those questions on the Q&A button rather than in the chat. And we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A after the interview, and we'll moderate that Q&A and have some more discussion with the audience. So let me go ahead and introduce our moderator and our interviewer. Dr. Tatjana Lichtenstein is an associate professor of history and the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research and teaching focuses on minorities, nationalism, state building, and war and genocide in Eastern Europe during the 20th century. At UT, Dr. Lichtenstein teaches courses on modern Jewish history, undergraduate surveys, and specialized graduate courses on the Holocaust, as well as courses on World War II in Eastern Europe, one of which is a seminar on Poland that is part of the Frank, is it Denius? Normandy Scholars Program on World War II. Last year, she helped to launch a new undergraduate minor at UT in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, a field in which this book under discussion fits quite squarely. Presently, Dr. Lichtenstein is working on a research project that explores the experiences of intermarried Jewish and non-Jewish families in German-occupied Bohemia and Moravia during the Second World War. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Lichtenstein and turn things over to her.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Dr. Bush and Dr. Westerman, for inviting me to be part of this event. I am really, truly honored to be here today to discuss what I think is a really groundbreaking book. I'd like to do two things in my introduction. I first want to introduce Dr. Westerman and his work in Holocaust studies. And then I want to give audience members who might not have read the book yet a really brief overview of the book's main argument. And we'll get into the specifics of the book later in the discussion. Dr. Edward Westerman is a professor of history at Texas A&M University in San Antonio and was recently appointed Texas A&M University System Regents Professor, A&M's highest academic honor. He's the author of numerous books and articles, which I'll return to in a moment. And he's the recipient of numerous prestigious fellowships from the German Academic Exchange Service, Southern Methodist and Harvard Universities, as well as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, among others. Most recently, he was selected a J.B. and Marie C. Shapiro Senior Fellow at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In 2019, the Texas State Senate named Dr. Westerman a commissioner for the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. In addition, he's an award-winning teacher and known among his colleagues in Holocaust studies as a most generous, warm, and supportive colleague something I can personally attest to as we collaborated on creating the Texas Holocaust Scholars Network. Dr. Westermann has published widely in military history and Holocaust studies, a list that is simply too long and wide-ranging to go through here. Many of you know that Dr. Westermann has had a distinguished career in the US Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. And the range of his expertise and the high regard for his scholarship is reflected in the numerous positions he holds on advisory boards and review panels, and the fact that his work is not only used in college classrooms, but also in police and Air Force academies. Dr. Westermann started out in what one might call more traditional military history with his first book, Flak, German Anti-Aircraft Defenses, 1914 to 45. He soon turned his attention to the German conquest of Eastern Europe during World War II, and specifically the murderous work that the German police and security forces did there. First came Hitler's police battalions enforcing racial war in the East, then the comparative history, Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, comparing conquest and genocide, and last, the subject of today's discussion, drunken genocide, alcohol and mass murder in Nazi Germany. In his research on the Holocaust, Dr. Westermann's focus has been on perpetrators, the men and women that participated in mass violence and murder in Nazi Germany. Research on perpetrators asks the fundamental question: how is it possible for seemingly ordinary people to perpetrate mass murder, to participate in the destruction of entire communities of people? As we've learned, genocide is a phenomenon that is as old as human history. Yet the scale of murder and the brutality of war and occupation during the Second World War brought the question to the forefront with new urgency. Since then, it is a question that scholars of Holocaust and genocide studies continue to research and debate. Indeed, the last time a scholarly debate over perpetrator motivations spilled over into the public, non-scholarly arena in a really big way was in the 1990s. Then two scholars, Christopher Browning and Daniel Goldhagen, who had studied the same source materials, reached opposite conclusions about why ordinary Germans became willing killers. One of the significant outcomes of this debate was that it brought renewed attention to the German police as a key instrument in the racial war in the East. In his first book on the Holocaust, Hitler's Police Battalions, Dr. Westermann showed that Nazi leaders created a uniform police force with a militarized organizational culture that was permeated by Nazi racial ideology. This organizational culture, he argued, was key to transforming civil servants into political soldiers and mass murderers. Westermann's research thus highlighted how norms and boundaries for behavior are both embedded in a particular historical and cultural context, as well as shaped by psychosocial dynamics. His work continues to deepen our understanding not only of German perpetrators, but also of the thousands of East European men that were enlisted by the German security forces to kill alongside and sometimes instead of the Germans. The violence and murder perpetrated by these foot soldiers of genocide in the ghettos, the killing fields and camps of the Nazi Empire was not distant and industrial. It was intimate, face-to-face murder, torture, and violence. In Drunken Genocide, Dr. Westermann explores how alcohol, celebration, and male bonding facilitated the torrent of torture, rape, and murder that these men inflicted on their mostly Jewish victims. He shows how Germans experienced a state of dual intoxication, of power and of alcohol. In Eastern Europe, where Germany's colonial conquest was infused with racial ideology, and where unrestrained brutality against the region's Jews and other civilians was the norm, SS and policemen felt intoxicated with the power of life and death. In Westermann's words, they experienced a heady feeling of psychological supremacy over inferior populations. At the same time, alcohol consumption and drinking rituals, behaviors learned in the male environments in which these men were reared, were integrated into the men's daily routines of guard duty, killing, and torture. Before, during, and after killing, they celebrated and bonded over the violence they inflicted on their victims. He shows that in this hyper-masculine culture, manhood and male group solidarity were produced by the killers through rituals of celebration and mass murder. Thus, unlike what the killers themselves claimed after the war, namely that they used alcohol to cope with their orders, Dr. Westerman shows that alcohol and revelry facilitated the kind of bonding and camaraderie that in turn engendered brutality and aggression. As you can probably tell, in the book we'll be discussing today, Westermann delves into some of the darkest scenes of the Holocaust, acts so cruel that it was hard to read on. It's a story of the joy of killing, the rituals of humiliation, sexual violence, and murder competition that accompanied the day-to-day mass murder perpetrated by Germans in Eastern Europe. Dr. Westermann, congratulations on this book. It's a major achievement that I really think will change the conversation about how and why people kill and inflict violence. I'd like to start our conversation by asking you how you first came to the topic of alcohol and mass murder in the Holocaust.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lichtenstein. I'd also like to thank Dr. Bill Bush and all those who are here today for taking the time out to listen to this this discussion. And the start of this book actually stemmed from the start from my work in the classroom. And in fact, as I teach the Holocaust course here at Texas A&M San Antonio, I rotate different books through, and during a couple of semesters, I'd used Father Patrick Dubois' The Holocaust by Bullets, and I've incorporated Wendy Lower's the Hitler's Furies, looking at women in the Holocaust. And in looking at those two books over a course of a couple semesters, I was struck by the perpetrators' use of alcohol. For example, Father Dubois talks about a scene where a young Ukrainian girl remembers that her aunt had to prepare meals for the killers, and these banquets would be set up near the killing site. And she also remembers watching the destruction of an entire Jewish community of a small town. And she describes the perpetrator, a single policeman who's wearing a white smock, and that policeman would march down the line, executing individuals one bullet at a time. And then at the end of finishing that row, he would go and grab a small glass of schnapps and drink it. And it was a very clinical way of drinking that struck me in that description. And then when we look at Wendy's book, she talks about how, again, these feasts, these banquets would be set up. And it really got me to thinking about how alcohol use that you see in so many different sources as such a ubiquitous activity in the East, to really kind of focus on this topic that was hiding in plain sight and kind of delve into it some more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, in the book, it's very, very rich in quotes from sources, from primary sources, and your source base for this book is very, very rich as well. You use a range of documents, both official ones, but also interrogation and trial records, witness and survivor diaries and testimonies, as well as photographs. And in addition, in order to explain some of the phenomena you're observing, you draw on social scientific literature. Now, historians have not always been so open to the broad range of sources, first of all, of primary sources, but also not to the use of social scientific research on historical subjects. So I wonder if you can talk about how the diversity of sources that you use and those many different scholarly perspectives that you bring has shaped the conclusions in your book. And also, I think related to that, what do you think are really the most important insights and contributions that you make by focusing on alcohol in the East?
Yeah, those are a series of really great questions. Thank you. First of all, for some of our viewers, there was a debate a couple of decades ago, really, in Holocaust historiography, and there was discussion of, are we focusing too much on perpetrator testimony, for example? Are we looking at the Holocaust through the eyes of the Germans? Because, in fact, there was so much documentation in German sources that we could find in a lot of rich things, whether it was post-war trials, whether it was the actual paperwork of annihilation that is so plentiful in archives. And there was a move to say, well, let's incorporate the views of the survivors and the witnesses, and especially of the survivors themselves. And that has its own richness and complexity. Those who witnessed things, who were actually at these events and for one reason or another survived these events, or who saw family members killed while they were hiding, in a house or in a forest or something like that. So we saw this move to integrate the victims and survivors memoirs as well, some of the ghetto diaries that we have, some of the information from the ghettos. So that was another kind of enriching of the historiography. And I think those were very important. Those were very important initiatives. Then we had the so-called photographic turn, where we really started to explore how photographs, both by the victims themselves or survivors or bystanders or even the perpetrators, if we look at those photographic pieces of evidence, how can we incorporate our understanding of photography just beyond what's on the photo, to kind of question the source, to kind of question perspective and what it's showing. And again, I think that again enriched our understanding of the source base. But this move to social sciences and looking at what the social sciences can offer, actually, I think Chris Browning's book, which you brought out, in Ordinary Men, he attempts to do that at the end of the book. Kind of, he references Stanley Milgram, for example. He references Irvin Schaub's work, and Philip Zimbardo's work is referenced there. And I think what that did, to Chris's credit there, it really opened the door to historians being able, especially those of us who are working on perpetrator studies, where we're trying to get into the motivations of individuals, to really say, okay, well, what's out there? And one of the things that, as I started on this project, that was clear to me is that there's a lot of literature, for example, in criminology, in psychology and sociology, that deals with alcohol use, perceptions of masculinity, alcohol use and acts of sexual violence, and alcohol use and physical violence. And so that contemporary research actually that looks at that in forums from like university settings, which I'm sure we might return back to discuss, to dominant male cultural events, whether it's rugby teams, whether it's military groups or paramilitary groups. What I was immediately kind of able to see is the applicability of those sources in helping us to understand the behaviors of perpetrators under National Socialism and in Europe during the Nazi dictatorship. So what that really, all that together is really, I think, an important part of it. The other thing I would say is that we as historians kind of sometimes become myopic on certain sources, that if it's over 20 years old, kind of like, okay, that's old stuff. And what that often leads to is us as historians reinventing good scholarship that has taken place in the past. And I think of Claudia Kuhn's Mothers in the Fatherland, and there's some really great insights there. Theodore Abel's collection, the sociologist Theodore Abel, which is widely known in his essay contest at getting Germans to kind of explain why they were supporting Hitler. And so what's really interesting about that is I think we can go back to these sources. And because alcohol was more or less ignored in this, is there's a lot of historical evidence there from Nuremberg trials, for example, perpetrator testimony from that period, that allows us to kind of bring that back, right? To bring that narrative back and see what was happening with this discussion of alcohol. And to answer your final part of your question is what's unique about this? I think as someone who's done perpetrator studies for about 30 years now, it's very difficult. As you know, there are multiple depictions and multiple variant answers for, is it, is it something effective? Is it something situational? In other words, is it something people believe that led them to do this, or was it the situation itself? Well, one of the key things about that is we also see that geography, chronology, and situation all work together and in different ways. And that kind of enriches, I think, our understanding of this event. Now, we may have some military, former military members watching this. And when I talk about this, what they also understand is things that are done downrange or in theater, that different rules sometimes apply to certain behaviors. And that just means maybe normal behaviors, things that you couldn't get away with on your home post or your home base, that people don't focus on those types of things, whether it's how your bed's made, whether it's how your uniform's arranged. So I think that one of the things that this book does is it really looks at the East, especially that you talked about, and this zone of exception, as it's been talked about, and to see how situation, geography, and chronology work to really expose these kinds of behaviors that we see in the East that are different from Germany proper and from Western occupied territories. So my hope is that this really kind of opens the door for thinking about the role of alcohol, especially in the Holocaust. But as I mentioned in the book, I think there are other examples and other genocides that it can be incorporated into as well.
Mhm. I actually wanted you see if you could expand a little bit about Eastern Europe as a zone of exception. What do you mean by that? Is there an example or something that you remember that could sort of show people how this is a place that really, where there's this expansion of boundaries for what kind of behavior is tolerated or encouraged?
Yeah, I think the clearest example of that is with respect to sexual violence. So if we had been having this conversation probably 25 years ago, the standard historiographical answer would be, did SS men or policemen assault Jewish women or Slavic women in the East? And the answer was no, of course not. That's, racial defilement. They would never, maybe there was isolated aspects. And then what we had is we had a generation actually of female historians, Regina Mühlhäuser, for example, Birgit Beck, Rochelle Seidel, and others, Helene Sinnreich is another, who really started to explore this aspect of what was taking place in the East. And these historians very clearly demonstrated that sexual violence against Jewish women and Slavic women, in fact, was a routine, a norm. And in fact, looking at this topic, one estimate that's done by SS and police authorities is at least 50% of SS and policemen were involved in what the Nazis would have termed racial defilement. In other words, sexual violence against Jewish women or Slavic women. Now, this zone of exception in the East, I would compare that, for example, as I do in the book, with if we're looking at occupied territories in the West, in France, for example, where sexual violence does occur, but it's also it's also punished in a very direct way. So military authorities in the West, when I have an example of how a German soldier is accused of having sexually assaulted a French girl, and his punishment is the next day to be shot. And in fact, the French mayor of that town and French officials are brought out to actually witness this shooting. And so we see a dichotomy between the things that are allowed in the East and the things that are allowed, for example, in the West. And that, I think, is a kind of a fascinating insight, and it allows us to look into how this racial ideology really operated differently and established different norms for different areas. And I think that also gets back to your last question, what's the insight? Well, we talk about racial ideology and the way it works, But we can also see that geography matters in that sense. And so I think that is one clear example of where we see a definitive difference, how the East is a zone of exception versus other areas.
If we can stay in the East for just a moment, I'm wondering if you think that with the fall of communism, which is now a long time ago, a generation ago, yet it revolutionized the history of Europe in many ways, and certainly the history of the Second World War with the opening of archives in Eastern Europe. Could you see that yourself when you were going through your materials, that there were aspects of your research sources you would never have gotten your hands on had it not been for the opening of archive and access to people in the East?
Yeah, that's kind of a yine answer. So it's a yes and a no. And the answer is there certainly has been regional, national-based historiography, whether it's Romania, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Poland, whether it's Belarusia, for example. In fact, yes, there's been a lot of micro-level research, and that's really important when you're looking at a topic that is this focused, right? I call it, looking for the bottle in the haystack, but you find a lot of bottles in the haystack to kind of mash that metaphor. So that has been very helpful. And the opening of those archives have included new materials and new research agendas that I've been able to use. But there's also really an interesting point that the fall of the wall allowed for. What some of the viewers may or may not know is there were a whole series of black books, Jewish black book, Ukrainian black books. These were books that were published after the war and largely in the communist, some of them in the communist East, and they were witness descriptions of what had happened to them under Nazism. And unfortunately, a number of historians allowed those to kind of fall under what I would call that Cold War dichotomy, where people were dismissing them as, oh, this is, communists using this as propaganda against Germans, West Germans especially. And so some of those source bases became really suspect. But one of the things that my work revealed, in fact, is that those are actually very powerful source bases, and that in fact the information that they provided really aligned with other testimony and other witness statements. And because a lot of these were done so soon after the war, that the descriptions by the victims or the bystanders who saw this gave us insight into what was happening in the daily lives of occupation policy in Germany. So one of the insights that I've had, I would have been under that group of maybe considering those kind of suspect sources before 1989 or 1991. But what's very clear to me is that those are actually very valuable sources for us as historians, and I think they deserve a relook by historians in that respect.
So that's another example of things hiding in plain sight in some ways. They were out there the whole time. But we had to change our mentality and the questions we were willing to ask of them. I wonder if you can, in the book, you talk about these rituals of celebration and the ways in which alcohol, it was so pervasive in the daily routines and life of these men. Wondering if you can give viewers an example of how alcohol was actually used, like this idea of it being the celebration and bonding. Is there an example you can give that sort of illustrates that for people?
Yeah, one of the things that this ties, as you talked about earlier, it ties about perceptions of masculinity. So there's several ways to kind of approach this question. The SS and the police describe themselves as political soldiers, and so, but there was a real type of what I call SS masculinity. A hyper masculinity is the term that I choose to use, that ties militarized masculinity and perceptions of toughness and hardness and performative masculinity. And performative masculinity in the East comes down to things like people that have competitions, who kills the most, people that keep their scores with reference to others, people that are involved in sexual assaults that actually keep score of their tracking their numbers, if you will. And to give you one example of a specific unit outside the Warsaw Ghetto, Police Battalion 61 has a police bar. So it's their own bar that they keep there. And what you would have noticed if you were going to that bar, if you were allowed to go into that bar in the 1940s, is the first thing you would have noticed as you were going into the bar, you would have seen a bunch of notches in groups of fives that were actually carved into that door of that bar. And the answer is, what did that represent? Well, eventually there'll be about 500 notches carved into that door, and it represents some Jew who has been killed by that police unit, either at the wire, trying to smuggle, or trying to leave the ghetto. So the policemen are keeping their tally, their body count, if you will, on the door of the bar. Now, if we were to open that door and walk into that bar, then one of the places we'd walk to is there's like literally like a bar area where the drinks are served. And if we looked at that bar and then we looked above that bar, we would see a Jewish Star of David as a light fixture. This very cynical, right? This very cynical kind of incorporation of this symbol of Judaism in the police bar. And then if we were to turn around from that bar and look across the walls in that room, what we would see is self-made murals that depict policemen doing their duties and caricatures of Jews, including one where a Jewish man is reaching down to grab a potato and a policeman is standing behind him with his weapon drawn to shoot him. And so you have these tables arrayed, right? These murals were drawn by the policemen themselves. You have the tables in the bar where these men are going to celebrate, drink, and sing, and they're celebrating amidst these symbols. And if I were to draw another example to kind of get to this is one that stuck in my mind as well, is when the policemen of Police Battalion 101, that's Chris Browning's group, were in the Łódź Ghetto. They got there in about November of 1940. And so there are photographs of that police unit celebrating their Christmas party in December of 1940. And as one might expect at a celebration, you see men drinking and singing. But there's one photo that I found particularly insightful about their mindset, because it shows a group of 3 policemen in their gear, and they've got a hold of a guy who is obviously another policeman, who they've dressed as a Jew, and he's holding a basket. And so they're laughing as they're holding on to him. They're doing a skit. And what's clearly happened there, this is a skit depicting a Jewish man who's been caught trying to smuggle. Now, there's no violence associated with that skit, but what you'd have to know is over the past month before that skit occurred, that these men have made regular use of their weapons in shooting and killing those involved in smuggling. So why is that important? Well, what it means is that these policemen in their Christmas skit chose to commemorate one of their duties in a kind of amusing way for their colleagues that involved the murder of Jews. And I think that to me is extremely insightful. And I'll just do one more because this is another kind of powerful image for me. And I've talked about this in a number of different fora. Ruth Elias actually came from Theresienstadt from Terezin. She's deported to Auschwitz, and she remembers being assigned. She's about 20 years old. She was a very good-looking woman, and she is assigned to Block 6, which is for young girls, and also the male camp orchestra is kept there. And what she remembered is drunken SS men, guards who would come into that barrack at night, and they'd be drinking and singing. And the first thing that they would do is they would wake up the male orchestra and tell the men they had to play music. The next thing that they would do is they would start climbing into those bunks in grabbing these young women and sexually assaulting them. And Elias talks in her testimony with Claude Lanzmann for Shoah, and these are part of the Shoah outtakes that I used, how she's pressed against the top bunk. She's pressing against the back of that bunk because she's on the top. She's hoping they're not going to see her and they're not going to use the effort to try to go all the way to the third bunk. But she can hear the screams of her fellow prisoners, and her remark is, the music had to play. And so this was very much a stage type of activity, and it's not just a one-time activity. She describes it, it's a routine activity that takes place. And so you see this kind of this celebratory ritual, the staging, the use of music, the incorporation of alcohol and song. And I think that it really gives us an insight into the nature of how the perpetrators thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If for anyone studying other genocides too, some of the scenes you describe of the sexual violence and the drinking and that sort of celebratory nature, during or after the events, I think the rituals of humiliation too really stand out. That's something you read about both from Bosnia, but certainly there are lots. It really rings familiar with Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda. And one survivor from Rwanda has described, people describe the drinking, the feasts and so on, but also that survivors in some way who were hearing, they were hiding, hearing these parties would in some ways build up knowledge and calculate how much time they would have the next day to before the killers got going again, which was a daily routine in some places in Rwanda. And so my question is to you, with the drinking is just so astonishing, there's so much of it, and it's such heavy drinking. When we're reading through your book, at what point did drinking become an obstacle for these men's job, right? The work that had to be done. Like, were they so drunk that they couldn't keep track of the people they were taking out to be shot, for instance? Was it easier for people to escape? What about aiming? What about not getting up in the morning and basically not getting going on the next day's killing mission because they were too hungover? So is there a point where this excessive drinking doesn't facilitate murder, but it becomes an obstacle to getting the job done?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And some of the sources that I have are because, in fact, that the shooters were drunk and their aim was off. And so individuals who were only wounded and fell into, for example, the pit were able to get out later during the evening or after the killers had gone. And that's the reason we know, for example, what was happening at some of these sites. We know also that inebriation led to additional suffering for many who were not killed outright, but just grievously wounded and had to suffer then before they actually succumbed to their wounds. It does. One of the interesting things that one sees in this discussion is there is this heavy drinking, and it does influence. It also influences sometimes individuals in the police that get into arguments with their fellow policemen, and their readiness to use their weapons in these arguments I find really, really interesting, because their normalized weapons use has become so normalized for them that even in their contact with their comrades, you can see it sometimes used. And Himmler, for example, notes that that's happening and is very angry about that aspect of it. But what I don't necessarily see is guys saying, well, I wasn't able to get up in the next morning. And I think the reason that that's missing is I certainly think that they were impaired. But part of this masculine idea is your ability to hold your alcohol and not show the effects of it. And so I have a number of testimonies where individuals say that they've been drinking what we would consider quite astonishing amounts, but they make the point, but it didn't impair my ability to drive. It didn't impair my ability to do my duty. And that's really more of an insight, not into the truthfulness of what they're saying, but into the nature of the male ideal that they were espousing, that you can drink and still, be able to do what you're doing. And it doesn't prevent, for example, these numerous examples. One that really sticks in my mind is you have a group of SS and policemen who are celebrating, and it's December 31st. So they're celebrating the new year, and they're getting ready for the new year. So they've been drinking at night, like a lot of people who celebrate the new year would do. But what's the thing that they decide to do after the new year has struck? Well, they decide to go into the nearby ghetto and hunt Jews. And a Jewish survivor remembers these drunken SS and policemen coming into the ghetto, and what she said, shooting Jews for sport, and that's the term that she uses. And so I think that's really a revealing insight into those perpetrators' mindset, that they're celebrating, and how do they want to start the new year? By doing an activity of killing Jews. And to me, again, these are the kinds of stories that really show us what the mindset was like.
I think also it shows in some ways, like just examples again you used about people being wounded. Some managed to survive, but others would just die an excruciating death. The overwhelming power of the Germans, and there was in some ways always enough killers to be found, that it was the victims, it was so difficult to evade these actions, and even to then survive, if you actually managed to crawl out of the pit wounded, what came after was maybe years on the run. So there was little to stop them, except for maybe Himmler's worry about how easily they used the weapon on each other. Much like he was worried about, sometimes the impact of the shooting on his killers, right? One of the things that also really struck me in your book, in your chapters, you make this effort to ask the question. So you're looking at, again, these kind of foot soldiers of genocide, but you're also looking at the German military, like so the Wehrmacht soldiers there. You're also looking at the East European helpers, the so-called auxiliaries, so ordinary men from Eastern Europe, not necessarily local, enlisted into German service and often deployed in these kind of security missions, so to speak, so that often involves attacks on civilians. So if drinking and the masculine cultural context and the norms that come with that, and what you show in the book is that it's really very similar across these different groups. And the brutality, the sexual violence is widespread among Wehrmacht soldiers as well. One of the things that I really thought about reading this is, so what happens when the war is over, right? Because these men who had spent a long time in Eastern Europe and really had this sort of everyday life of drinking and killing or torturing, raping, and so on, they go home, right? The ones that make it home. And this is, of course, and with the millions of men mobilized in the East, this is a large number of people. So what happens in post-war Germany? Do you have any, I don't know, this is obviously beyond your research, but what happens to this kind of behavior, this routine aggression against women, for instance, in post-war German societies?
Yeah, I think there's two great projects that could be tied into this. The first one is domestic violence under the Third Reich. So I would be very interested, right? And there's not very much that I've found very interested of looking at, with this hyper-masculine ideal, these very distinct gender norms that are kind of posited under the Nazi regime. What does domestic violence look like? So that would tie in with exactly this discussion. So what happens after that war? And I think that if we were to look at the 1950s, for example, and the 1960s, and again, I don't know of any historian who's really worked on that, but I think one could approach this very topic by exploring domestic violence and the way it's portrayed, the way it's reported or not reported. One example that I can give you where it makes a difference for a specific German woman is her husband was a policeman who was involved in this and in these actions, in these killing actions. And the only reason that the German authorities find out about it is not because he goes and reports himself, and it's not because his buddies in the police battalion can't deal with their conscience, and, and they go and report themselves. It's because the wife, who's been abused by the husband, physically abused by the husband, finally has enough, and she goes to the police and she reports what he was involved in the East. And his nickname had been the Terror of Lemberg, for example, she recalls. And he made the boast that he could, shoot somebody in the head while eating his brot, right, while eating a sandwich, right? And so the way we find out about his actions is through the wife, but the wife's actions are predicated on the fact of his violence towards her, right? Is what kind of leads to her making the accusation with the police. So I think, domestic violence, as we all know, and ideas of masculinity, that's not specific to Germany in the 1950s, right, or the 1960s. Not specific to anywhere. We could talk about communities today in this very issue. But I do think that one of the ways of looking at this, the way you're talking about, would move through that using that kind of source base to say, what do we find? And then, of course, the other thing that would be tied to that would be popular literature about male norms, female gender norms in that period. What's the kind of, what are the kind of sources that are out there, and how are they distributed, right? And certainly, I think some of the pulp literature that we might see in that period would also kind of reflect that. I mean, we can talk about James Bond, right, and Sean Connery's depiction of James Bond in movies, right? And we see a very different nature between, for example, Daniel Craig's depiction that we see today, right? And that's based also on socially constructed gender norms and the way one can, quote, interact, right, with a person from the opposite sex. So I think that would be it would be a great topic. So when you get done with that book, I want to buy it first, and I'll ask you questions.
I wonder too. One of the things you describe again in the book are those the social evenings, right, that people would have. So before the war, the SA, right, these smaller units, localized units as well. You sort of wonder if these kinds of environments didn't just pick up where they left off after the war, once things were a little settled, and some of those rituals didn't continue that they had already had before the war.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. But I also talk about Pete Hamill's book, Drinking Life, and he talks about New York bars in the 1940s in working class neighborhoods. And he makes 2 points about them. It's a male-dominated environment. Women normally are not allowed into those bars. Any woman that's allowed normally has to sit in the back. There's like a back room for women, and they're kind of, morally suspect, right? A woman going into those bars. And the other thing is not only drinking is there, but competition, male competition, to include your ability to use your fist. So they are very, very much dominated male environments. And we see that same thing with the stormtroopers that you're talking about here, that those SA pubs or those SA Heime are male dominated environments. And when women are allowed in, what's very interesting about that they're normally not allowed in, but when they're allowed in, the men can drink, the women can only drink soft drinks or water. They're not allowed to drink alcohol in those environments. So, some of these ideas, right, some of these gender roles that we talk about with respect to Nazi Germany or Weimar Germany into Nazi Germany are also, reflected in other cultures, Western cultures. And that's why I think that's kind of the power also of the book in this topic. As you talked about, Rwanda, I think deserves, as I say in the book, it deserves a study of its own. And I make some parallels there and I discuss it briefly, but I also find, like you do, that there's much that could be done with this topic in looking at the Rwandan genocide.
Yeah. This actually brings me to my next question, which is, again, the male-dominated environment. You've already mentioned some of the pubs, right? The rugby teams and so on. So does your book, that some of the findings help us think differently about, again, militaries, sports teams, university fraternities, where there are these male environments? Are you thinking differently about this? Do you think there are lessons or insights that should be maybe highlighted here?
Yeah, I do. I think, again, this gets us back to some of the sociological research. Peggy Sanday did a great book, Fraternity Gang Rape, where she looked at fraternities as the sites of male bonding and kind of masculine culture where drinking is off the charts, really heavy drinking, but also sexual violence. And one of the comments that she makes in her study of this particular fraternity is that group sexual violence, gang rape, is less about the act itself and more about the performative nature of joining the group, being part of the male group, right? So it's like a community bonding event. We see exactly that dynamic in the Nazi East, but you also see it in the Far East. Some Japanese units can talk about this, so that this idea of sexual violence as a method of community bonding amongst men is certainly there. Certainly, we know that things like rugby teams, we've seen descriptions of the same type of kind of hyper-masculine activities, heavy drinking, sexual violence, including militaries. Pilots who are known for liking to drink, but also very male bravado is a key part of that kind of identity. And so I think what it does do is it kind of explores how these identities can in themselves be influenced and created through the use of alcohol. And I think that should be a caution in thinking about that. And there's been certainly there have been numerous examples. The Tailhook Convention, for example, for the U.S. Navy in Las Vegas involved many of these same kind of behaviors. So I think it shows us that kind of underside, if you will, of that kind of bonding.
Hmm. Now, before we open it up to questions from the audience, I see there's a couple in the Q&A. I want to ask you, because you say yourself, this was a hard book to write, right? It's a difficult, really difficult source material. And even within Holocaust studies, there are gradation of difficulties in terms of the materials. So I'm wondering where you want to go next. What's your next project?
Well, it stays kind of on the dark side. In the book, I explore this idea of recreational violence and spectacular violence. And that's not specific to the Nazis. We see that, for example, in the US South. Lynching is an example of that. People posing for photos, making postcards of lynchings. I think that this idea of recreational or spectacular violence really kind of puts me back in more of the comparative perspective that I did with the previous book. But I think there's something to be said about looking at those kinds of activities. So another very dark book, but I think another important topic.
Absolutely. So I think we should open it up to the audience members' questions. Bill, do you want to do the first question, and then I'll find a second one?
Absolutely. And I first just want to thank both you and Dr. Westerman for a really fascinating conversation. I am still waiting for my copy of the book to arrive in the mail, but I can't wait to read it. It cuts across so many kind of academic research boundaries and asks such important questions. We do have a number of questions popping up in the Q&A, so I will start with the first question, and this comes from one of our students. This is Aaron Janik, and he asks, when you and other historians perform research on the Nazis with Black books and perpetrator studies, is there a method you use to discern fact from fiction? Is it difficult to tell if these people are telling the truth even in their journals and diaries?
Yeah, Mr. Yannick, that's a really great question. And source criticism, like we've talked about in class, is where you really have to start. I think when we deal with the perpetrators, for example, what is really revelatory for me has been when individuals admit to being part of something or start to talk about what they saw. Because what you find in most of those interviews is people saying, I wasn't there on that date, I was away, or I never saw anything. And so a lot of that source material really is very exculpatory, is what you see. When you see drinking talked about, for example, an acceptable way of talking about this is to say, well, drinking was my coping mechanism. And there's two reasons for that, because it's like US law. If you're drunk, if you're considered volltrunk, which is mean completely drunk, you receive it's diminished capacity. And so the court looks at that. And the second reason is it makes sense that normal people go like, yeah, there's no way you could do that if if you were sober. Nobody could be involved in that. And what we don't understand is, yes, you could be, because that's the kind of people we're dealing with. So when you have people that directly incriminate themselves or provide really specific detail about what they saw, that kind of helps you. But I think it's multi-source is what you also have to think about. So, for example, we were just looking at Huss's autobiography, or death row memoir, in the class that we talked about, Commandant of Auschwitz. But you also have to look at, well, what are the prisoners who were in Auschwitz saying about Huss? What do we know that other individuals who interacted with him said about him and his actions, right? What do the documents that he wrote say about him? So that's kind of the historian's craft in trying to get exactly to that answer, is how much can we trust just one source, or how much do we need to kind of link up sources together? And I'll give you one more example that's in the book. I have a perpetrator source talking about a killing, where the perpetrator's talking about how they were drinking and music was incorporated. And then I have a woman who was at the site, was survived this killing, talking about the same event. But she doesn't mention the use of alcohol, but she mentions several of the activities. So the sources actually agree on what happened, but from her perspective, the drinking of the individuals just didn't register, or she wasn't asked, or it didn't occur to her, right? So when we can match up these kind of perpetrator and survivor or bystander sources together, I think that can be very powerful testimony.
So unfortunately, I don't know who's a student and who isn't, but Merit Rendebral, she asks that you talked about these rituals of masculinity among perpetrators. And she's wondering if there are other ways gender came up in your research, or if you like to say, you're teaching a course in the fall, if you want to say a little bit about maybe how you plan on teaching this in the fall.
Yeah, Merit's a colleague, so she's a
Oh,
professor
sorry.
no, that's okay. She's a professor at the university, and she and Phyllis Barragan-Getz run the Women in Gender Studies program. They've done a really amazing job of putting that program together and kind of giving it new life. And in fact, what I think is important when we look at gender, as I've talked about before, and as I talked about from Wendy Lower's book, is that we know, in fact, that women, when genocide is a societal event, that women also become involved. They become actors in this event, and explaining why they become actors. And there's really an insightful part in Hitler's Furies, where Erna Pitre, she's a mother, and she captures these Jewish children, and she decides her husband's not there, and she takes them out to a nearby forest area, and she executes them herself. And then when she's interrogated by the East German police after this incident comes out later after the war, her answer is, well, she didn't want to seem less than the men. And one of the things that I've seen also in the concentration camps is, there's an example I use in the book where a female guard actually takes away the whip from a male guard who's beating a prisoner and says, "You're not doing it right." And she assumes that she starts that. And I think it was really fascinating how even in a society that had very clear gender distinctions, that women still had agency or could adopt that agency to, show the men how it was done, but not by reference to the standard ideal of femininity in that in that society, but by reference to the male ideal that they were also appropriating. So I think what we see is that gender works in a number of different ways. It certainly impacts the victims in when we talk about sexual violence, for example, in a very direct way. Less so in the sources do I see male sexual violence. That's again another area that it's there in some cases, but it's much harder to find, at least in the sources that I've looked at. So I think that this diversity of how gender plays a role, how women may become involved, for example, in the celebrations after the killings, right? In the sharing of goods, of dresses and of clothes and of things taken from those who've been murdered. We see their participation in another light is in that case as well.
Thank you. I've got the next question, and this also comes from a student, and it actually is very similar to a question that I wrote down in my notes. So I'm going to kind of combine the two just a little bit. This is from Matthew Rucker, another one of our students, and he asks if alcohol was the only form of substance abuse that you found in your research. And I was kind of curious about that too. Anecdotally, I've encountered sort of mentions of other sort of cocaine and speed and other amphetamines and those kinds of more sort of drugs of aggression, right? And wondered if that also played a part in this story.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Thanks, Mr. Rucker. He's in my Holocaust class. So I would say yes. There's actually a book out. Norman Ohler, who's a German journalist, did a book that its English title is Blitzed, where he looks at, for example, the use of like Pervitin, which is a methamphetamine, by German troops during World War II. And he attempts to draw kind of a cause and effect linkage so that these guys are essentially high on speed, and that kind of it can explain some of their willingness to engage in these kind of violent activities. However, I think it's really kind of problematic, that the direct cause and effect. Number one, because if you have 3 million service members on the Eastern Front, going into Russia, and let's say you have 18 million doses of Pervitin, right? Well, you start doing the math, and what you start to find out is actually it's not that much per person. And what I also found is in looking at this topic, Himmler, for example, the head of the SS and the police, repeatedly talks about alcohol and alcohol misuse and abuse. I have not found one document where he's talked about the abuse of Pervitin, for example, or methamphetamine or narcotic drugs by the perpetrators. And I think that's extremely important, because this is a guy who got down into the details about everything. For example, he's interested in venereal disease rates within the police. We'll talk about specific examples of that, right? And so I think that the omission there, this is the dog that didn't bark, right? The omission of that discussion amongst the SS and police forces is really important. And again, I think one of the things I'm very clear about in the book, that the Holocaust would have happened with or without alcohol. So it's neither necessary nor sufficient for the killing, but the way it's incorporated into the killings is really gives us, like I said, a profound insight into the nature of the way the killers thought about their acts.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Garrett Rouse. This is an interesting question. You do actually talk about this in the book, the connections between the First and the Second World War in terms of the alcohol use in these German units, so military police. And so what are the connections, what changes over time? What are the connections between those events?
Yeah, and again, Mr. Rouse is in the Holocaust class there, so I'll give him a shout out there for that. Yeah, we've talked in an earlier class, we used Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, and what you really see in German military units in World War I, at least from Junger's perception, is this really masculine environment, and this drinking as part of that, this going into combat as being like an intoxicating kind of activity for those involved, camaraderie and male bonding that takes place. And I think what's important to say is one of the things about doing this topic is you have to put alcohol within the cultural context of the society you're looking at. And so we see a continuation of these kinds of behaviors. For example, if we look at pub life in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, where pubs become oftentimes associated with political groups and drinking as part of that, and kind of sites of political mobilization and even political violence that stems out of this. Also anti-Semitism, which gets tied to some of these political groups as well. So the incorporation of some of these drinking rituals into kind of the manifestations of either verbal rhetoric that's aimed at enemies or anti-Semitism, or even verbal rhetoric that turns into then acts of aggression against political opponents, I think is really an important part of that. So the Nazis really don't create anything new. You know, Hitler borrows, even the idea of Aryan is borrowed from these racialist thinkers of the 19th century. And so what we see is these pre-existing conditions that what the Nazis are good at doing is kind of adapting them, and in some cases bending them towards their own ideas of masculinity, of racialized thought. And so that's where I think we see some of the continuation, is their ability to adapt these groups or these rituals to their own purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we have time for about 2 more questions. And I'm going to take a little moderator's license here and ask you a question of my own. I'm curious of what you think, what insights you think we can gain from your findings into the rise of authoritarian political movements in the here and now, which certainly there have been a lot of historical comparisons drawn, some of them not so, persuasive, and some of them, potentially persuasive. And it just seems to me that some of the things that you're talking about in this study could have some real relevance for us as we try to understand our world, in 2021.
Yeah, I think that's again another real good question, because Bill, you and I both think that history should help us inform our understanding of the present. We've had that discussion. One of the areas where I definitely saw that, Nancy Love has a book called Trendy Fascism, and I talk about that in the book, where she looks at white power music groups and their use of drinking ritual, their use of music, the ferocity, the volume of it, right? And that's something that ties back in to some of my discussions and looking at how the Nazis used music in drinking, and the types of words, the lyrics of the songs, how it's delivered, right? So I think we definitely see it in that group. I do know I gave a talk last night, and one of the viewers contacted me afterwards and said, for example, that he was aware that January 6th, that many of those who are the Proud Boys had been, drinking, and then they would go on these kind of looking for Black Lives Matter activists or whatever, and energize out into these forays of physical violence, right? And I do think that now, I don't have the sources on that, but that dynamic would not surprise me from everything I've talked about here, that groups that have these highly structured racialist ideas, this perceptions of militarized masculinity, and this racialized thought coming back together, and drinking then accelerating that camaraderie and then that kind of willingness to engage in political violence. I think absolutely that we could trace manifestations of that. And to me, it's another one of those topics that's worthy of consideration, and maybe a book like this kind of generates some of that dynamic or some of those discussions.
Mhm. I want to take it back to Hitler and the big Nazi leaders. One of Gloria Edwards asks, well, let me just expand. Hitler was a famous abstinent, right? And she asks if any of the other top Nazi leadership were either alcoholics, and I'll add to the questions, or were known to use alcohol in that sense. And how do we reconcile this encouraging of the use of alcohol for these social events with also this complete rejection of it by someone like Hitler, who was so admired? Do we need to resolve that tension?
Yeah, it's a good question. Miss Edwards is another Holocaust class member, so my extra credit thing probably is helping me out here to get some audience, but that's okay. I appreciate it. It's a great question. Yeah, Hitler's known as a teetotaler. Now I have to kind of modify that picture a little bit. We do have discussions of Hitler taking bitters, what are like bitters drinks after dinner, which are an alcohol-based kind of drink, right? And at the end of his life, we know in the bunker that he actually does drink. There are reports of him drinking, but he's for all intents and purposes, he doesn't drink. He doesn't believe drinking or smoking, either one. He doesn't allow people to smoke in his vicinity when they're around him either. So there is that difference. And there's also a campaign in Nazi Germany. It's called the drinking question, where Leonard Conti, who is the health minister, is pushing this whole idea that German youth should not drink, should not drink or smoke because of the health dangers that it involves. But when we get to the majority of those who are involved in leadership, whether it's Lai, who is the head of the Reich Labor Front. This guy is notorious for being drunk and drinking a lot. Reinhard Heydrich, who's head of the security police, is also a drinker. Himmler himself drinks and smokes cigars. I've got pictures of him, smoking these cigars as well. We see that that this is a widespread behavior, and in fact, after I talk about it after the war, that there are certain Hajamal Schacht, who is indicted at Nuremberg, tries to say, well, yeah, the way that, these were really good people, and the only way that they could do the things that they were doing and kind of go along with Hitler was to drink and to, take narcotics. So what you start to see is the building of this alibi, right? That if they hadn't been doing that, they would have been good, decent people, right? So they've been decent perpetrators. Again, I think that what we see is that the ideal that even Himmler thinks about how alcohol is supposed to be used by his men is, hey, you have half a liter of beer or a liter of beer, and you sing songs and you recite German poetry and you build camaraderie. Well, that's his ideal, but that's not what it looks like in the field, right? That's not what's happening. And so I think it's this distortion again, this paradox, maybe one of many paradoxes that we see in National Socialism, that the ideal is in no way represented by the reality, right? Even though, as you correctly note, that there's this image of Hitler as this guy who doesn't drink or smoke, and then why doesn't that seep down to other levels? Well, it just doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. I want to again just reiterate our gratitude to Dr. Lichtenstein and Dr. Westerman for this fantastic conversation. And I want to thank all of our viewers for joining us and for asking such great questions. This recording will be available on the History Department Facebook page, hopefully within about 24 hours. We may have it available through YouTube as well. And again, if you attended this session, we will be sending out the flyer from Cornell University Press with the discount code. If you have not yet ordered this book and you know you need it, that will be made available to you. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Our session to an
Thank you
end.
so much. Appreciate it.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.